The docking bay was chaos. Valkyrie security forces had established a perimeter around the transport ships, their weapons raised and their scaled faces twisted with fear and confusion as they watched the impossible army pour through the access corridors. Like water breaking through a dam, Commander Vethra stood at the center of the defensive line, a rank insignia gleaming under the harsh lights of the bay as she assessed the situation. With the cold calculation that had made her the youngest officer to ever command a preservation station security force, all specimens are classified as contaminated, she announced through her communicator, a voice carrying across the open space with the weight of absolute authority. They have been exposed to the humans' influence and are no longer suitable for preservation. All units are authorized to use a lethal force. The freed creatures pressed together at the entrance to the bay, their bodies tense with fear and uncertainty as they faced the weapons arrayed against them. Yuna pushed through the crowd until she stood at the front, the Vorath at her shoulder and Uncle Bear at her back, and Sundel beside her with all four arms raised in a gesture of peace that the Valkyrie either did not recognize or chose to ignore. "We do not want to fight," Yuna called out, her small voice somehow carrying across the distance. "We just want to leave." "That is not possible," Commander Vethra replied. "These specimens represent years of collection and study. They are property of the Valkyrie Biological Preservation Authority, and they will not be released to wander the galaxy spreading contamination." Property. The word hung in the air like poison. Yuna felt the creatures around her react to it, felt the fear transform into something hotter and harder, as they were reminded that to the Valkyrie they had never been people at all. The battle began without warning. A young Valkyrie soldier fired the first shot, his nerves breaking under the pressure of facing an army of monsters, and the energy bolt caught a small creature near the front of the crowd and dropped it to the deck in a smoking heap. Everything after that was chaos. The freed specimens surged forward in a wave of scales and fur and fury, their individual fears consumed by the collective rage of beings who had finally been pushed past the point of tolerance. Uncle Bear charged into the Valkyrie line like an avalanche, his massive paws swatting soldiers aside, while his thick fur absorbed energy blasts that would have killed anything smaller. The Kaiden siblings worked as a team, their hard shells deflecting weapons fire as they targeted the Valkyrie's communication equipment and severed the connections between squad units. The Vorath was a nightmare made real, 6 legs carrying it through the defenders with terrifying speed as it scattered soldiers without killing them, because Yuna had asked it not to kill and it had chosen to honor that request. But they were losing. More Valkyrie reinforcements poured into the bay from auxiliary entrances, and the freed creatures were being pushed back despite their numbers and their desperation. Yuna watched Uncle Bear fall. The massive creature took 3 energy blasts to the chest as he shielded a group of smaller specimens from concentrated fire, and he dropped to his knees with a sound that was half roar and half sigh. Yuna ran to him without thinking, her small body dodging through the chaos until she reached his side, and she pressed her hands against his warm fur as his gentle eyes found her face. "Go," he rumbled, the first word she had ever heard him speak. "Take them and go." "Little one, not without you," Yuna said, tears streaming down her face. "Already going," Uncle Bear replied, and his voice was soft now, soft like the winter wind on the frozen world he would never see again. "But you stay. You keep opening doors." His eyes closed, his great chest went still, and Yuna knelt beside him in the middle of the battle and felt something break inside her that she had thought was already broken. Torvax watched from the edge of the bay. He had followed the specimens down from the vault, telling himself that he needed to observe the situation and gather data for his report. But the truth was something else entirely. The truth was that he could not look away from the human child. She was kneeling beside the body of a creature that had been nothing more than a number in his files. And she was crying with the kind of grief that the Valkyrie had spent centuries convincing themselves that primitive species could not feel, and all around her. Creatures were dying for the chance to be free. Torvax thought about all the specimens he had cataloged during his career, all the beings he had studied and classified and preserved, and he wondered for the first time how many of them had been crying inside their cages while he walked past. Without ever looking at their faces, he made a choice. Torvax moved to the bay control console and entered his authorization codes, and the massive doors that led to open space began to grind open behind the defensive line. Commander Vethra spun to face him, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Something I should have done a long time ago," Torvax replied. And he transmitted coordinates to every nearby system with receivers capable of detecting Valkyrie emergency signals. "I am ending this." He turned to face Yuna across the chaos of the battle. "There is a transport at Bay 7, he called out. "The access codes are 6492 Alpha. Go now, before the reinforcements cut off your escape route." Yuna stared at him for a long moment. This Valkyrie researcher who had kept her in a cage and studied her like an insect. And she saw something in his eyes that she had not expected to find. Shame Sundel's voice cut through Yuna's grief like a blade. "We must move. Child, we cannot let his sacrifice be wasted." Yuna pressed her hand against Uncle Bear's fur one last time, whispered a promise that she would not forget. And then she rose to her feet and raised her voice above the noise of battle. "Bay 7, she shouted. "Everyone to Bay 7 now." The freed creatures rallied around her call, breaking off from combat and streaming toward the transport that Torvax had identified. And the Vorath cleared a path through any resistance with the unstoppable force of a creature that had finally found something worth protecting. The transport was larger than Yuna had expected. A cargo vessel designed to carry specimens between collection sites, with life support systems capable of sustaining multiple environmental requirements simultaneously. She did not know how to fly it, but Sundel did. The ancient Kathrani had traveled between stars before the Valkyrie had even developed spaceflight, and her 4 hands moved across the control console with the certainty of deep experience as she powered up engines that had not been used in months. Creatures poured through the transports, cargo doors in a flood of desperate hope, packing themselves into every available space with no regard for species or size or the ancient enmities that had divided them before Yuna had taught them that freedom was more important than fear. 63 survivors made it aboard before the Valkyrie reinforcements cut off access to the bay. 63 out of hundreds, but 63 was more than 0. And Yuna stood at the cargo door as it sealed shut and watched the station shrink behind them as Sundel pushed the transport into open space. She did not look away until the preservation station was nothing more than a point of light against the darkness. The transport emerged from hyperspace 3 days later above a world that Sundel called Haven, a sanctuary planet established by species who had escaped Valkyrie collection and built a community dedicated to helping others do the same. Yuna stood at the viewport and watched the green and blue surface grow larger as they descended. And she felt Bomi press against the legs and heard the soft clicking of tack and vest behind her, and sensed the warm presence of Devara standing guard at the door. "You did an impossible thing," Sundel said, appearing at her side with 2 of her 4 hands clasped in a gesture of respect. "You reminded us that we were people." Yuna shook her head. "I just opened doors," she said. "You walked through them yourselves." The transport landed on a field of soft grass, surrounded by structures that looked like they had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. And the cargo doors opened to reveal a crowd of beings who had gathered to welcome the newest refugees to their world. The freed creatures filed out slowly, some hesitant and some eager, and all of them blinking in the light of a sun that was not filtered through station barriers. And they were met with gentle hands and soft voices and the patient kindness of those who remembered what it felt like to emerge from darkness. Yuna was the last to leave the transport. She walked down the ramp with Bomi in her arms and the Varth at her shoulder, and she looked out at a world where she would never be a specimen again, where no one would walk past her cage without looking at her face. She was 8 years old. She had lost her parents and her home and a gentle creature who had died so that others could live, but she had also gained something that could never be taken away. She had gained a family, and as she walked into the light of a new sun, surrounded by creatures who loved her and trusted her and would follow her through any door she chose to open, Yuna made herself a promise. She would keep opening doors every cage she found, every prison she encountered, every place where living beings were kept against their will and treated as property rather than people. She would open them all, because that was what humans did. The main holding area was a cathedral of cages. Yuna stood at the entrance and looked out across a vast chamber that stretched into darkness in every direction, filled with row upon row of reinforced enclosures that glowed with soft blue light from security barriers designed to contain the most dangerous specimens in the Valkyrie collection. These were the creatures that had resisted capture. These were the beings that had fought back against their imprisonment. These were the monsters that the Valkyrie feared even as they studied them. And they were kept here in this isolated section of the station, where their rage and their power could not threaten the orderly operation of the preservation station. Sundel appeared at Yuna's side, her forearms folded across her chest as she surveyed the chamber with ancient eyes that had seen many terrible things but still found room to be impressed by the scale of cruelty on display. The Valkyrie call this place the Vault, the elder said through their mental link. They bring specimens here when standard containment proves insufficient, and most who enter do not leave alive. Then it is time for them to leave, Yuna said simply behind her. The freed creatures from the upper levels crowded together in nervous clusters, their fear of the Vault warring with their trust in the small human who had led them this far. Uncle Bear pushed through the crowd and stood beside Yuna, his massive form casting a shadow over her tiny body. And he made that same deep sound in his chest that might have been a growl or might have been a promise. Tak and Vess clicked urgent warnings through the network as they reported movement in the corridors behind them. Valkyrie security forces finally organizing a coordinated response to the chaos that had consumed their station. We do not have much time, Vess warned. Then we will be fast, Yuna replied, and she walked into the vault without hesitation. The first enclosure she approached contained a creature that looked like a spider made of shadows. Its 8 legs tipped with claws that could slice through metal, and its body covered in fur so dark that light seemed to fall into it and disappear. The creature pressed itself against the barrier as Yuna approached, mandibles clicking in what might have been threat or might have been anticipation. Yuna entered the access code. The barrier dissolved. For a long moment nothing happened. And then the shadow spider flowed out of its enclosure with movements so fluid and fast that Yuna could not track them. And she felt the brush of fur against her shoulder as the creature passed her and joined the growing crowd of freed specimens. She moved to the next enclosure and the next and the next, opening cages that held predators and hunters and beings that the Valkyrie had classified as too dangerous to ever release. And each time she stood at the threshold and met their eyes and waited to see what they would choose. Most of them chose freedom. Some of them chose violence, their minds too broken by captivity to recognize liberation when it stood before them. And Uncle Bear intercepted these lost ones and held them gently in his massive arms until they stopped thrashing. and realized that the world had changed. Around them, Sundell warned Yuna when she approached a specific enclosure near the back of the vault, one that pulsed with additional security barriers and warning lights that flickered red in the darkness. This one is called a Vareth, the Elder explained. It has killed 7 Velkari handlers since its capture, and the Keepers believe it is incapable of anything except violence. Yuna looked through the barrier at the creature inside. The Vareth was massive, larger than Uncle Bear, with a body that resembled a wolf from Earth but stretched and twisted into something else entirely, with 6 legs and a mane of spines that clicked together when it moved and eyes that burned like coals in the darkness of its cage. It was pacing back and forth with the restless energy of something that had forgotten what stillness felt like. And when it saw Yuna standing at the barrier, it stopped and fixed those burning eyes on her small form with an intensity that made the creatures behind her back away in fear. Yuna, Sundell cautioned. Perhaps this one should remain contained. Yuna shook her head. Cages are wrong, she said. Even for monsters. Even for the ones who have forgotten how to be anything except what the cages made them. She entered the code. The barrier dissolved. The Vareth burst out of its enclosure with explosive force, its massive body slamming into the floor hard enough to crack the metal plating. And it rounded on Yuna with spines, raised a mouth open to reveal teeth that could crush bone like dry branches. The freed creatures behind her scattered in panic. Uncle Bear moved to intercept, but Yuna held up her hand to stop him. She stood alone before the monster, and she did not run. The Vareth lunged forward and stopped, with its snout centimeters from her face, its hot breath washing over her as it growled with a sound that vibrated in her chest and made her bones ache. Yuna did not move. She looked into those burning eyes and saw something behind the rage and the violence and the years of torment. Something that might have been confusion, or might have been recognition, or might have been the last spark of a creature that remembered what it felt like to be more than a weapon. She raised her hand slowly and held it out, palm up, just as she had done for the bird creature at the beginning of the night. I know, she whispered. I know they hurt you, and I know you want to hurt them back. But hurting them will not undo what they did. It will only prove that they were right about what you are. The Vareth stared at her hand. The growling faded to silence. Then, impossibly, the massive creature lowered its head and pressed its snout against her palm. And Yuna felt the warmth of its breath and the slight tremor that ran through its body as it chose to be something other than what the cages had made it. Torvax arrived at the entrance to the vault with a squad of security personnel, and froze when he saw what awaited them. The chamber was full of freed specimens, creatures of every description, gathered together in clusters and crowds that should have been impossible. Predators standing beside prey, ancient enemies sharing space without conflict, all of them oriented toward the small human who stood at their center with her hand resting on the head of a Vareth that had terrorized the station for years. Return to your enclosures, Torvax ordered, his voice amplified by his communicator as he tried to project authority he did not feel. This station is under full lockdown. All specimens must return to their designated habitats immediately. Yuna turned to face him. She was 8 years old and barely taller than his waist, and surrounded by creatures that could tear him apart before his security team could fire a single shot. But she looked at him with eyes that held no fear and no hatred and no violence, only certainty. No, she said. Torvax felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that this single word from a human child carried more weight than anything he had ever said in his entire career. You do not understand what you have done, he said, trying a different approach. These creatures cannot survive outside this facility. They have been removed from their natural environments and conditioned to depend on the systems we provide. You are not freeing them, you are condemning them to death. Yuna tilted her head slightly, considering his words with the same focused attention she had given to learning access codes and mapping ventilation systems. You took them from their homes, she said. You put them in cages and told yourself you were helping them. But you never asked them what they wanted. You never looked at them and saw people. You only saw things to be collected and preserved. She gestured to the creatures gathered around her. They would rather die free than live as your exhibits. The Vorath raised its head and fixed Torvax with those burning eyes. And the Valkyrie researcher took an involuntary step backward, as he confronted the reality that this child had accomplished what his entire species had believed impossible. She had united the specimens she had, given them something to fight for, and she had done it not through force or manipulation, but through the simple act of opening doors and offering her hand to frightened creatures who had forgotten that kindness existed. What do you want? Torvax asked. And he was surprised to find that he genuinely wanted to know the answer. Yuna smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had already decided how this story would end. I want a ship, she said. And I want you to let us leave. The docking bay was 6 levels down. Torvax knew that his security team could not stop them. Not with the creatures she had freed. Not with the Vorath standing at her side like a guardian from an old nightmare. He had a choice to make, and for the first time in his long career, he was not certain that the Valkyrie way was the right one. The night of open doors began in silence. Yuna slipped through her vent with practiced ease, her small body moving through the darkness like water through cracks in stone. And she merged into the corridor with her heart beating, a steady rhythm against her ribs. She was not afraid. She had been afraid when the transport ship burned around her family. She had been afraid when the Valkyrie hands pulled her from the wreckage and sealed her in a container. But she was not afraid now, because fear was for creatures who had something left to lose. And Yuna had already lost everything except the fire that burned in her chest and demanded that she do something with the life she had been given. Bomi waited in the enclosure, keeping watch as always. And Yuna knew the creature would sound an alarm through the mental network Sundell had established. If any Valkyrie approached during the critical first phase of the operation, the extended maintenance cycle had begun 3 hours ago. The corridors were empty, and the automated systems were running on minimal power, and the Valkyrie staff had retreated to their quarters to sleep through the boring business of routine station upkeep. It was time Yuna moved to the first enclosure on her list and entered the access code with fingers that did not shake. And the barrier slid open to reveal bird-like creature with iridescent feathers and a beak that curved downward like a sad smile. The creature did not move. It stared at the open doorway with eyes that had forgotten what freedom looked like. And Yuna understood that this was the moment Sundell had warned her about. The moment when she would have to do more than just open doors. She stepped into the enclosure. The bird creature flinched back, pressing itself against the far wall with wings folded tight against its body. And Yuna knelt down slowly until she was at eye level with the frightened being. I know, she whispered. Her voice, gentle and warm like her mother's voice had been when Yuna was small and scared of the dark. I know you are afraid, and I know you have forgotten how to be anything else. But I need you to trust me for just a moment. She extended her hand, palm up, offering rather than demanding. The bird creature stared at her hand like it was a trap. Then, slowly, it extended one trembling wing and touched her fingertips with feathers that felt like silk. Come with me, Yuna said. And she stood and walked toward the open door. And she did not look back because she knew that looking back would seem like doubt. And right now these creatures needed her to be certain. The bird creature followed her one step at a time, wings still folded tight, but moving forward through the doorway. and into the corridor and tasting air that was not the recycled atmosphere of its prison. For the first time in years, Yuna moved to the next enclosure and the next and the next, entering codes and opening barriers and stepping inside to touch frightened creatures and speak soft words that carried more meaning than any language. Some of them followed her immediately. Some of them needed more time and more gentle coaxing. Some of them did not follow at all, too broken to remember how to move. But Yuna did not judge them for their inability to accept what she was offering, because she understood that healing took different amounts of time for different wounds. The Chitin siblings joined her operation after she freed them from their adjacent enclosures, their compound eyes gleaming in the dim light as they clicked instructions to each other and spread out to serve as scouts along the corridors. Tak moved ahead to watch for Valkyrie patrols, while Vess stayed close to Yuna and the growing group of freed specimens that followed behind her like baby birds following their mother toward an uncertain but promising horizon. Uncle Bear was harder. The massive creature sat in his enclosure and did not move when Yuna opened his door, his gentle eyes fixed on something far away that only he could see. And she knew that whatever the Valkyrie had done to him had carved wounds so deep that her words alone might not be enough. But Yuna had never been good at giving up. She walked into his enclosure and sat down beside him, her small body pressed against his warm fur. And she did not speak or try to coax him or do anything except be present with him in his pain. Minutes passed. Then Uncle Bear turned his massive head and looked at her. Really looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes like ice breaking apart in the spring. He made a sound deep in his chest, a sound that was half growl and half something else entirely. And then he rose to his enormous feet and followed Yuna out of his cage. The alarms began 37 minutes into the operation. Yuna had opened 47 enclosures by then, and the corridor behind her was filled with creatures of every size and shape and species, moving together in a river of scales and fur and feathers and things that defied easy description. Torvax burst out of his quarters when the alarm reached his console. His scaled face twisted in confusion as he tried to understand the data scrolling across his screen, because what he was seeing should not have been possible. 47 enclosures open, 47 specimens missing, and at the center of the security footage, a human child walking calmly through the corridors while an army of freed creatures followed behind her. Impossible, he whispered, his clawed fingers trembling as he tried to input commands that would seal the affected sections and contain the breach. It is just a cub. How could a cub do this? But the seals did not respond because Yuna had mapped the system during her weeks of observation and had identified the maintenance access points that controlled local barrier functions. And Tak had severed 3 critical connections on his scouting run, while Vess guided the group around the resulting blind spots. The Valkyrie had designed their security to stop adult specimens. Using adult methods, they had never imagined a child who could fit through vents and memorize codes and build alliances across species barriers through nothing more than kindness and determination. Sundell reached out through the mental network as Yuna approached the junction point where all the freed creatures would gather before the next phase. The Valkyrie are mobilizing, the elder warned. They know something is happening, but they do not yet understand what, and their confusion will not last forever. It does not need to last forever, Yuna replied through the link. It just needs to last long enough. She led her growing army through the corridors toward the central lift system that would take them to the main holding area on the lower levels, where hundreds more enclosures waited in the darkness, where creatures too dangerous for the standard habitats were kept in reinforced cells that the Valkyrie checked only once per rotation. The bird creature with iridescent feathers flew ahead of the group now, its wings spread wide for the first time since capture, and it sang a song that none of them understood, but all of them felt in their bones. Uncle Bear walked at the rear of the column, his massive form a wall of protection between the freed creatures and any threat that might come from behind. And his eyes were clear now and focused and filled with something that looked very much like Purpose. Torvax watched the security feeds with growing horror as he finally understood what was happening. This was not an accident or a malfunction or a single specimen making a desperate bid for escape. This was a liberation, and at the heart of it all was an 8-year-old human child who had looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible was just a word used by people who had given up too soon. Sound the general alarm, he ordered through his communicator. Wake everyone and seal all access to the lower levels. We cannot let the specimens reach the main holding area. But even as he gave the orders, some part of him wondered if it was already too late, because the child on his screen was still moving forward with absolute certainty, and she had the look of someone who had already decided how this story would end. Una felt the vibrations of the general alarm through the floor and heard distant shouts as Valkyrie's staff scrambled to respond to a crisis they could not comprehend. She did not slow down. She did not look back. There were still doors to open and creatures to free, and she would not stop until every cage on this station stood empty. The transport ship had been burning when they found her. Una remembered the smell of smoke and the screaming of metal as the hull broke apart around her family's colonial vessel. And she remembered the cold hands of the Valkyrie as they pulled her from the wreckage and placed her in a container like she was nothing more than a broken piece of cargo. She was 8 years old, and she had just watched her parents die. Now, she stood in a glass enclosure on a station that orbited a massive orange planet, and she watched the reptilian creatures walk past her habitat without ever looking at her face. And she understood with terrible clarity that to them she was not a person at all. She was a specimen. The Valkyrie Biological Preservation Station stretched for kilometers in every direction. A maze of corridors and chambers and thousands upon thousands of glass enclosures just like hers. And inside each enclosure was a creature from somewhere else in the galaxy, collected and cataloged and preserved like dead butterflies pinned to a board. But these butterflies were still alive. And that somehow made everything worse. Una pressed her small hands against the transparent barrier of her habitat and watched a Valkyrie researcher pause at a console nearby, his scaled fingers moving across holographic controls as he reviewed data about the specimens under his care. And she noticed that he never once looked directly at any of the creatures in the enclosures around him. His name was Torvax. Though Una did not know this yet, she only knew that he smelled like chemicals and walked with the stiff precision of someone who had never experienced chaos or fear or love in his entire existence. Her enclosure was comfortable enough by any objective standard, with soft bedding and climate control and automated systems that provided food and water at regular intervals. And she supposed that the Valkyrie believed they were being kind to her by giving her these things, but kindness without freedom was not kindness at all. It was just a prettier kind of cruelty. Una spent her first days in the enclosure watching and learning, her dark eyes tracking every movement of the Valkyrie staff as they went about their routines. And she memorized the timing of guard patrols and feeding schedules and the specific gestures the researchers made when opening enclosure doors. The other creatures in nearby habitats did not do this. They sat in silence, staring at nothing, their bodies present, but their spirits long since departed to some place the Valkyrie could not catalog or preserve. And Una understood that they had given up hope so completely that they had forgotten what hope even felt like. She refused to become like them in the enclosure directly across from hers, separated by a wide corridor that the Valkyrie used for transportation. There lived a small creature that looked like a fox from Earth, but with 6 legs and fur that shifted colors depending on its mood. Yuna named it Bomi, which meant treasure in the old language her grandmother had taught her before the colony ship left Earth's system. Bomi was the only creature in the nearby enclosures that still showed signs of life, its ears perking up when Yuna pressed her face against the barrier and made silly expressions, its tail wagging slightly when she waved at it across the impossible distance. Between their prisons, the Valkyrie did not notice this interaction because they did not believe their specimens capable of meaningful connection. This was their first mistake. Torvax paused at his console one evening during what the station called its night cycle, when the lights dimmed and most of the staff retreated to their quarters. And he frowned at the data scrolling across his screen as he reviewed the behavioral patterns of the newest human specimen. Excessive movement patterns, he muttered to himself as he added notes to Yuna's file, his clawed fingers tapping against holographic keys with practiced efficiency. Illogical attachment behaviors toward specimens in adjacent enclosures, possible indication of cognitive dysfunction common to primitive species. He did not consider that her movements might be purposeful. He did not imagine that her attachment behaviors might be the foundation of something that would soon shake his entire world. Yuna had discovered something important during her careful observation of the Valkyrie routines, something that made her heart beat faster with an emotion she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The enclosures were designed to contain adult specimens of various species, with barriers and locks and security measures calculated to prevent escape attempts from creatures of standard proportions. But Yuna was a human child, small and flexible and capable of fitting into spaces that the Valkyrie engineers had never thought to secure. The waste extraction vent in the corner of her enclosure was barely 30 centimeters wide. Yuna was very good at making herself small. She waited until the deepest part of the night cycle, when even the automated system seemed to slow down and the corridor outside her enclosure stood empty and quiet. And she crawled to the vent and pressed her fingers against its cover and felt the screws give way one by one as she worked them. Loose with patient determination, the cover came free with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silence. Yuna did not move, her body frozen in place as she waited for alarms or guards or the cold hands of the Valkyrie coming to drag her back to the center of her habitat. But nothing happened, and no one came, and she realized with growing wonder that she was already forgotten. The vent was dark and cramped and smelled like recycled air and cleaning chemicals. But Yuna crawled through it without hesitation, her elbows scraping against metal as she pulled herself forward centimeter by centimeter. And she emerged in the corridor between enclosures, with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, and her spirit burning brighter than it had since the day her parents died. She was free, but freedom for herself alone was not enough. Yuna crossed the corridor on silent feet, her bare toes cold against the smooth floor as she approached Bomi's enclosure, and she studied the control panel beside the transparent barrier with the same focused attention she had given to watching the Valkyrie researchers throughout her captivity. The code was 4 symbols long. She had watched Torvax enter it 17 times. Her small fingers pressed the holographic buttons in sequence, and the barrier slid open with a whisper of displaced air. And Bomi bounded out of its prison and pressed its warm body against Yuna's legs with a sound that was half purr and half cry of overwhelming joy. "Come on," Yuna whispered, scooping the creature into her arms and holding it close against her chest. "We have to go back before they notice." She returned to her own enclosure through the same vent, pulling the cover back into place behind her. and she curled up on her bedding with Bomi hidden beneath the blankets. And she smiled for the first time since the universe had taken everything from her Torvax. Checked his console the next morning and frowned at several minor anomalies in the security logs. Errors that suggested brief fluctuations in the barrier systems of two enclosures during the night cycle. But he dismissed them as technical glitches and moved on to more important matters. After all, no specimen had ever attempted escape from the preservation station. Why would they want to leave when the Vajra went? Valkyrie provided everything they could possibly need. Yuna watched him walk past her enclosure without looking at her face. And she scratched Bomi behind its ears and began planning her next move. Because she had proven to herself that the cages could be opened, now she just had to figure out how to open them all. 3 station cycles passed before Yuna made contact with the others. She had spent those cycles mapping every corner of her habitat level through the vents, crawling through darkness during the night hours while Bomi waited in her enclosure and kept watch with its color shifting, ears pressed flat against its skull in nervous anticipation. The preservation station was larger than Yuna had imagined, stretching upward and downward through dozens of levels, each one containing hundreds of enclosures filled with creatures from every corner of the galaxy. And she understood now that she was looking at a prison built to hold an entire zoo of stolen lives. But prisons could be broken, and Yuna had always been very good at finding ways through locked doors. The first intelligent being she made contact with was Sundel, a Kathrani elder with 4 arms and skin that looked like cracked stone and eyes that held the weight of centuries. Sundel's enclosure was 3 corridors away from Yuna's habitat, positioned in a section reserved for what the Valkyrie called higher cognitive specimens, as if intelligence could be measured and ranked like items on a merchant's inventory list. Yuna pressed her face against the barrier of Sundel's enclosure during one of her nightly explorations, and the ancient creature looked at her with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been pity, or might have been something in between. "You are the human youngling," Sundel said, her voice like stones grinding together, and Yuna realized with a start that the Kathrani was speaking directly to her mind rather than using sound that the Valkyrie monitoring systems might detect. "I have watched you moving through the vents like a small, determined ghost. You can see me," Yuna whispered back, her words barely audible even to her own ears. "I can feel you," Sundel corrected gently. "Your emotions burn very bright for such a small creature, little one, and I have been waiting to see what you would do with all that fire inside you." Yuna told Sundel about her plan, about opening the cages and freeing everyone and finding a way off the station before the Valkyrie could stop them. And she watched the elder's face for signs of the dismissal or mockery she expected from someone who had been imprisoned for so long. But Sundel did not dismiss her. She listened with ancient patience and then asked a single question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Even if you open every cage on this station, child, what makes you think the creatures inside will choose to leave, when most of them have forgotten what freedom feels like and fear the unknown more than they hate their chains?" Yuna thought about this for a long moment. "Then I will remind them," she said finally. And Sundel smiled with a mouth that had not smiled in decades over the following nights. Yuna built her network of allies through careful contact and whispered conversations, conducted at the edges of enclosures during the deepest hours of the station's rest cycle. She met the chitin siblings, Tak and Vess, insectoid creatures, with compound eyes and clicking mandibles, and a fierce, protective loyalty to each other that the Valkyrie had tried and failed to break through years of separation. Experiments. She met the creature she called Uncle Bear, A massive being covered in thick fur with gentle eyes and enormous paws that could crush bone but preferred to offer comfort. Who came from a world of eternal winter and endless forests and had not spoken since the Valkyrie killed his family during collection. She met dozens of others, some intelligent and some not, some hostile and some friendly, but all of them trapped and all of them suffering and all of them desperate for something to believe in, even if they had forgotten how to believe. Yuna gave them something to believe in. She gave them her plan. The night cycle in 12 rotations will be extended by 6 hours for station maintenance, she explained to Sundell during one of their mental conversations. Information she had gathered by watching Torvak's review scheduling documents on his console. That is when we move. You have learned the access codes for the enclosures, Sundell observed. I have watched them enter the codes hundreds of times, Yuna confirmed. I know every pattern for every section of this level, and I have mapped routes through the vents to reach every habitat on the upper deck. The Volcari will respond when they discover what is happening. The Volcari do not look at us, Yuna said with quiet certainty. They see specimens and data and categories in their files, but they do not see us. And that is why they will never expect this. Sundell regarded the human child with an expression that mixed admiration with something close to wonder. And she thought about all the species she had encountered during her long life and all the stories she had heard about humanity during the few decades since first contact. The humans were a young species by galactic standards, barely crawling out of their own solar system before they started bumping into established civilizations. And most of the elder races had dismissed them as primitive and unimportant and not worth the effort of serious consideration. But Sundell had lived long enough to know that youth could be an advantage rather than a weakness, and that the greatest changes in the universe often came from those who were too inexperienced to understand that what they were attempting was supposed to be impossible. The others are afraid, she warned Yuna gently. They want to believe in your plan, but they have been hurt so many times that hope feels like a trap to them now. I know, Yuna said. That is why I am not asking them to hope, because hope is too hard when you have been broken. Then, what are you asking them to do? Yuna smiled. And it was the smile of a child who had lost everything and decided to rebuild the universe, one small act of defiance at a time. I'm asking them to walk through an open door, she said. That is all, just one step and then another. And I will be there to take their hand if they need help remembering how to move forward. Torvax noticed more anomalies in his security logs that evening. Minor fluctuations that his rational mind insisted were nothing more than aging equipment and system degradation. But some part of him felt uneasy in a way he could not quite explain. He pulled up the behavioral data on the human specimen and frowned at the patterns he saw there, because the youngling's activity levels had increased rather than decreased over time, which contradicted everything the Volcari knew about the psychological deterioration that typically occurred in captive primitive species. Curious, he muttered, adding another note to her file. Specimen shows continued engagement with environment and apparent attempts at cross-species social bonding. Recommend observation for possible study of human pack-forming instincts. He did not recommend increased security. He did not suggest closer monitoring of the human's movements. Why would he? When she was just a child locked in a cage, no different from thousands of other specimens who had come before her and would come after her and would all eventually accept their place in the great catalog of the universe. Torvax walked past Yuna's enclosure on his way to his quarters, and she watched him through the transparent barrier with dark eyes that held secrets he could not begin to imagine. Soon, she whispered to Bomi, who was curled in her lap and purring softly. 12 more nights, and then we change everything. The creature's fur shifted to a warm gold color that meant contentment and trust. Una scratched behind its ears and began reviewing her mental map of the station one more time. Because 12 nights was not very long, and she had a lot of doors to open.